Why don't we get started this morning? Again, this is John Giordano from the Center for Economic Growth staff. We're pleased to present our first in our webinar series. The webinar topic is COVID-19, a supply chain perspective, and it will be given this morning by Tom Valentine of Mainfreight. Tom just got done delivering this webinar to a national audience, and so we are pleased to have him do it just for our region. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Tom Valentine. Thank you.
Hi, John. Good morning, and thank you, everyone, for having me. We're going to dispense, I think, to the benefit of the people that are on the phone. We're going to dispense with the who's Tom Valentine, who's Mainfreight stuff, and we'll leave it at if you'd like to know a little bit more about me or a little bit more about Mainfreight, we're happy to give you that. You can certainly reach out to me after the call, and really wanted to just jump right into the content. And I think, you know, I know this is a virtual event, but if you have a cup of coffee in your hand or nearby, if we can give everyone a sort of a virtual toast, raise that cup of coffee, take a sip, for a couple of reasons. My presentation and supply chain is usually not very dynamic, so you're going to need a coffee to stay with the program. And then really what I wanted to maybe sort of jump right into the content is The Economist published something in early March as some of the supply chain issues were unfolding. That cup of coffee that's in your hand, it took 29 companies across 18 countries to get it into your hand today. And that includes the cup, and that includes the coffee, and that includes the beans, and that includes the sugar, and includes the cream, and it includes any additives, any flavor you might have in there. It includes the packaging to those flavors and the things you may have bought at the store. It includes a whole host. And when you think about it, you know, something as simple as a cup of coffee, 29 companies across 18 countries. You know, really, it does set the tone for where this presentation is going to go today, which is, you know, the impact of the COVID-19 environment into the supply chain. And it was just interesting as early as just a few days ago, Drury's is a sort of an investment banking advisement group, and they have a specialization in supply chain within their group. And they put out a position that they believe all countries are going to suffer economic hardship due to the interconnected nature of world trade. That's a pretty bold statement. But I think as we hit some of the content moving forward and we move into some of the data, we'll see where that's really almost impossible for it not to happen. So again, a little bit of maybe the journey we'll take this morning. We're going to take a look at a bit of the context of sort of a snapshot of where we are now, and we'll move quickly into a little bit of an Asian focus, a European focus, a US focus, and then we'll maybe tie things up with a little bit of, you know, maybe some of the challenges that are in front of the current environment now. And then maybe, I think, what if this is the right way to say it, what I hope I bring to the table, what I hope my value is, not necessarily in the dynamic content you're going to see. At the very last slide, we're going to talk about some calls to action. And I believe that you know, anytime I would invest time in coming into a program or listening or learning about something, getting into a training environment or a teaching environment, I want to extract on my own a call to action. Does that drive me? And I think this particular environment, the impact we're seeing now, the disruption that has happened, I think there are some very important calls to action, and obviously that's my opinion, but I think as we get to those, and when we go through some of the things that have happened and maybe even talk about some of your questions, we'll see that they're probably pretty important. I would suggest not taking some calls to action would almost you know, be maybe dereliction of responsibilities in some cases. Just a couple of things in terms of how we go. Anytime you have a question, there's a chat box. You can put that into the chat box. You can put that into the question box. And John's been kind enough to say I'll take those questions in. And when we did this program a few weeks ago, it was comfortable to stop where we were and maybe dig a little deep into a particular point or a particular issue. So it won't be any problem if you have a question on a particular slide or data point. We can take it now. John will feed me the questions, and then we'll certainly do that again at the end. By the way of disclosure, this is not a policy or a political presentation. Be prepared to be underwhelmed. You're not going to get a lot of opinion out of this. It's really this is the only place you're going to see some things that are, call it maybe government oriented, and then we're going to go right into the supply chain piece. I do think this is an important place to start. Context, globally 2.4 million cases, 170,000 deaths, and the numbers that have recovered. Really, I think that by definition, a little bit of the uncertainty we'll see, and a little bit of, as we get to, what are some of the challenges moving forward, this regional spread and regional variation, it's a thing, and how and what shape it takes in terms of extending impact, and again, focus on our piece, supply chain disruption. You have these wide swings where, in North Dakota, you've got, less than 400 cases, New York with more than 240,000. Those are really, really, dynamic numbers. And I think that will be, that will come up again, that regional application. This is a presentation that probably leaves a little bit of the human element behind. When I did this presentation and I reviewed it for the first time, I realized that wasn't right. That there have been in New York State alone more than 15,000 deaths, and no matter what we talk about supply chain, you can get your goods tomorrow if you don't get them today. For some, it's a life-changing issue. So, and in Albany County, locally, we've got about 650 cases and more than 23 people have died as a result. From a policy standpoint, we see the stimulus package has been engaged, and a second round is now underway. Look, the testing variable, and I put that in here, this really becomes a challenge to understand, really that, again, that regional spread. Is it directly related to testing? Are testing variables, clinically sound in terms of what's being assigned to, a cause of death, and things like that? I think there is a testing variable that will continue to remain an impact in the supply chain disruption space. And then again, finally on the policy point, we see, the states now navigating, their own reopening, guided by federal protocols, and in some cases not guided by federal protocols. So wanted to jump right in to the supply chain impact in Asia, and I think, really to understand, when you come into, where's the sort of the genesis of all this, massive disruption. Again, let's leave the human element behind, and for the sake of the rest of this presentation, which is only about 6 or 7 more slides, we'll talk specifically about clinical supply chain stuff, right? And in Wuhan, you've got 200 of the global 500 firms with a direct presence in Wuhan. So now when you think about tier 1 suppliers supporting them, tier 2 suppliers supporting them, and the hundreds of millions that are sort of connected to that global, that the 200 plus of those global 500 firms, you really start to see how did this move so quickly, and how did the disruption become so significant. And again, probably the obvious, I think what's obvious is we know the impact of China and trade with the U.S., but China is also the largest source of imports for 9 of the 10 Southeast Asian economies. When you talk about, and this is, I didn't think about this before I'm about to say it, so I'll just let it go. When China sneezes, the rest of the world is going to catch flu. No pun intended, but it's hard to have missed the pun there. So I think really what we're going to see is a continued disruption, and we'll talk a little about places where infrastructure is a real challenge. And I think that's, where you'll continue to see that impact. It's interesting to note, small and medium-sized companies hit the hardest within this, and only 43% have resumed operations. When you talk about this, hey, everything's getting back to normal in Wuhan, let me tell you, we have 380 team members at Mainfreight based in China. We have significant, as a business, we're doing $300 million just origin China revenue generation alone, not what we generate and what our U.S. customers pay for. We are seeing a significant lack of startup in small to medium-sized companies, and we think that was going to be the trailing impact. Foxconn's going to come back online. GE's going to come back online. The big names are all going to come back online, and they're going to come back online quickly. Those small companies are going to be a real challenge. Just from a context standpoint, the dollars, you have the Forbes indicating the 314 billion in airline industry losses, 314 billion just for 2020, and I think the reality is, the names that we know, the Lufthansas, the Deltas, the KLMs, the Cathay Pacifics, the airlines that are going to, and the supply chain disruption that's in front of us, call it the Alitalias, the Norwegian Airs, those state, I don't want to use the word sponsored, but those state-supported airlines that are now losing hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, and economies that aren't built for bailout. That's in front of us in terms of where that impact lands. In Asia right now, and again, from a context perspective, I've been in logistics and supply chain for almost 35 years. So 9/11, the crash of the stock market, 9/11, the global financial crisis, significant industry disruptions, port strikes, industrial actions. I've seen a lot of market disruption. What we're seeing now, I've never seen $15 to $25 per kilo for air freight coming out of Shanghai and coming out of Hong Kong. This is 4 to 5 times anything I've ever seen. 4 to 5 times. And I think that's just really giving you context of, as things get going, yes, the supply chain can restart, and it will restart. But when you talk about injecting this type of cost on top of items that you aren't able to shift the selling price on, goods that have already been sold under contract, there's a financial impact way beyond what's happening right now that we're going to see in the next few months. And that is what will singularly sustain impact long after the supply chains are back and running. Call it, by summer things are good again. We're going to see significant financial impact in next quarter's numbers, the following quarter's numbers, and all the way through 2020. We're seeing unprecedented supply chain costs for every good being moved in every market sector. In terms of, again, impact to the supply chain, for those of you that are maybe seeing, or you're reading some things and you're seeing words like ghost sailings or blank sailings, that's essentially planned sailings that were scheduled to run, that the steamship lines have taken down. And I wanted to give you some context. The week of April 3rd, there were 45 blank sailings, which means that the steamship lines they were going to, and give you an example, they were going to go Shanghai, LA, Hong Kong, Charleston, New York. That's a single sailing. When they blank those sailings, they either remove them completely, or they skip a couple of port pairings. And the week of April 3rd, 45 blank sailings were replaced. There were 212 the week of April 10th. And I think for those of you, I did some sort of basic math, right? And just 2,500 an FEU is a 40-foot equivalent unit. Using 2,500 containers per vessel, that's 112,000 containers per week that were taken out of rotation. We're going to talk on the next couple slides about capacity issues. So think about this. All those containers were coming into the US. They're not here anymore. How do you get a container to go back out if the container isn't here that came in? Now, not so bad if you're sitting in South Carolina, you're sitting in Georgia, you're sitting in New York, you're sitting in New Jersey, you're sitting in Los Angeles, Southern California. You've got big, you're close to where the containers, the ones that are coming in are coming in. If you're inland, you've got some trouble, and inland container movements are going to be a real challenge. Right now, there is limited or no passenger space at all coming out of Asia for cargo. Arrangements are being made by charter only. Again, context, we've chartered 3 747s, Mainfreight. We've chartered 3 full 747s, 100% sold out each one of those flights. We've never seen this kind of peak in the market. Wanted to move to Europe. So you have what I would describe as two major players, DHL and CEG, declaring force majeure. And again, I know everybody probably on the call knows, force majeure as a legal term. It sort of, takes a contract. And this isn't so much about pricing. This is about within a lot of those contracts that DHL and CEG were managing were capacity commitments. So it's not about moving the freight at a certain dollar amount that they're worried about. There's no capacity. So where I was committed to giving you X number of kilos or X number of cubic feet or X number of cubic meters, I don't have that capacity. Those companies don't have that capacity anymore. It doesn't exist. And I think when you talk about supply chain disruption, that probably is the holy grail where companies of their global stature are declaring force majeure. Things are off the, you can call them off the rails. FedEx and UPS, a little bit maybe more household names, have suspended their guarantees. Again, that's only because of current capacity and market issues. 90% of the aircraft belly space has been taken out of the market. And I think in what was a real sort of a pointed space for me, for those of you that have been following Brexit and what I would describe as a solidarity and an alignment of the EU countries to keep their borders open and to remain committed to the, I'll call it the EU thing. For the first time in a very long time, those borders in those EU countries in the Shenzhen area have been partially or completely closed. That was originally scheduled for 1 month, starting March 17th. That now has been extended into the summer. This is an unprecedented border control issue. Harkening back to what previous days where there was no EU and there were actual customs borders in those countries. Canceled sailings on the Asia to North Europe and the Med services, affecting 235,000 containers a week right now. And in fairness, that stat is about 7 to 8 days old. It's even stronger than that number at this point. Everybody okay? Good to keep going? So what have we seen in the U.S.? So what we have seen is these intermittent port closures at ports of entry. That's not been a regulatory issue. That's been a health and safety issue. So what happens is, and I think you may have seen this in Miami, where they've had some of the workers at the terminals get sick. And once someone goes into like the medical office, they go, oh, you got, you've tested positive for COVID. They're immediately shutting down the pier and shutting down the terminal. Now many, and I use the word specifically intermittent because they are reopening, but we are seeing what I would describe as regular disruption of anywhere from a couple of hours to a couple of days, related specifically to health and safety issues at U.S. Seaports of entry. What we're seeing starting to play out, and for those of you that are in the ocean business and you're bringing containers in, you're going to see things that you haven't seen in the past. Some of you may be familiar with things like PSS, peak season surcharge. You may be familiar with GRI, general rate increase, but you probably haven't seen COVID-19 surcharge, container repositioning surcharge, chassis surcharge, demurrage surcharges, all now hitting your invoices. And we think those are going to not only continue and hold, we believe there's going to be an escalation in the dollar value of those surcharges as they continue. I talked a little before about the equipment imbalances. When you see container repositioning surcharges at $100, $200, $300, $400 a container, that's specifically what that's talking to. And I think that's going to be, even if you can get through the pricing piece, I believe that is going to be a factor delivering continued supply chain disruption for the export of goods from U.S. manufacturers that are in inland locations, as well as a consistency of their supply chain of getting raw materials brought into them as a result. This is going to be a bit of a long-term impact. One of the the factors, with U.S. GDP, the World Trade Organization estimates that global trade reduction between 13 and 32% in 2020. By the way, there's no, this is Tom Valentine's opinion, there's no chance it's 13%. It's way more to 20 or 30. We've already seen the metrics in play to deliver way beyond 10%. And now, I have a question mark. I don't know what that will mean for U.S. GDP, but I know that there was a, talk about a sort of a 2% or between 2 and 3% expectation of improvement or increase. And I would venture to say, as the economists continue to do their thing, that number's now been inverted, where it would not surprise me if we saw a 2 or 3% reduction in U.S. GDP as a result of global trade. Morgan Stanley, again, has a bit of a focus group, within the supply chain, and they made a particular statement that, while you hear the news about, and even in my presentation, about the airline industry, and we'll see in the next few slides about the steamship line industry, all being hit with hundreds of billions of dollars in losses, Morgan Stanley's position is that it's hitting brokers and 3PLs harder than the asset players. And that's going to be a very, very interesting piece of market shakeout within the transportation and the logistics sector is how do the undercapitalized and how do the non-asset control groups, how are they able to procure space? How are they able to service their customers? And how are they able to generate revenue? And I think, this particular market disruption, really legitimate questions in that space. Within the U.S., we've seen hours of service regulations suspended. Those are, for those of you that may know, that came into play last year, where now drivers are using ELDs, electronic logging devices, to manage their hours, awake hours driving. Those have been suspended as a result of the COVID-19 impact. In the presentation I did last week, 2 weeks ago, for the national group, the question came up to me, Tom, how do you feel about that? From a safety standpoint, what does that mean? And it was an interesting conversation. As much as I am in favor of anything that promotes trade, I'm a guy that uses the highways, and I'm not a fan of anything that increases or reduces, anything that reduces safety. again, challenging times and emergency times require different, decision making and values. But I got some question marks over the suspension of those regulations. I think in the U.S., what we're about to see, and I think, if you're watching the 6 o'clock and the 7 o'clock national news, you're starting to see more and more of this. I believe that farms and food are the next big pieces of supply chain disruption that we're going to see. And I think, to a certain extent, and I don't say this with a cavalier attitude, if somebody can't find your widgets online, if somebody can't get your gadgets procured, everybody's going to be okay tonight. If we see substantial impact where food shelves are not being stocked, or potentially you have infection that has hit the food chain, at that point, everything else we've talked about to this point is child's play, and the game changes substantially. So in this slide, I think this will be what I would describe as very confusing. You're going to see some good news, you're going to hear some good news, and you're going to see some, not bad news, but really challenging things. And that's why I've sort of titled this, is that light at the end of the tunnel, or is it green? We have Hapag-Lloyd, adding 100,000 containers into their vessel rotations as a result of that imbalance and as a result of trying to do their best. But Bloomberg and BIMCO, as late as yesterday, had a statement saying container shipping is developing into the epicenter of a global shipping crisis. So I think, when you talk about the numbers we looked at, 200,000 containers a week, 300,000 containers in disruption, adding 100,000 containers into a rotation, is it enough? Is it going to make an impact? You have Lufthansa converting passenger planes to cargo. I think some of you may have seen, there was a couple of sort of interesting pictures on Twitter and on LinkedIn of freight that was strapped into the aircraft seats on passenger planes. So they've turned no passengers, but they're putting boxes into the seats and strapping them in. And I think some of those planes are actually, they're removing the seats and trying to create some capacity to load cargo as well as best they can. Wuhan is reopened and production is coming back again, albeit I think that's a large cap story, much more than it is a small cap story. We're seeing improvements in loading ratios, which is again the number of containers and the capacity that's available versus what's being used. It is starting to make a comeback. The important thing in the devil in the details is there are less containers in that slot, so the increase in percentage off of a smaller number of capacity. There is some nuance in all of this. I think getting to some of the things that we're seeing on the positive side, we're seeing this directly, which is what I would describe as an unprecedented cooperation between large cap organizations and small cap, and including large companies extending, prioritizing accounts payable for small firms, extending AR terms for small firms, and then creating specific procurement opportunities to help drive and influence small and medium-sized companies, back to life where they've been completely shut down. I've never seen this in my time, this type of cooperation. I think, a really, really positive development. The Amazon story, and again, this presentation is not a referendum on Amazon, but they are, there's 100,000 plus new jobs that they're looking to create as a result of what's happening with their business. And I think what you're seeing is a strengthening of all the aviation, FMCG, fast moving consumer goods. So all of your DIYs, right? So your Lowe's, your Home Depots, all of your everyday commodities and everyday supplies. No surprise, as people are home and they're not on the road, they're doing more with their home, within their home, around their homes, and we're continuing to see a strengthening in those markets. And again, if you looking at call it just if the stock market is the benchmark, and I'm not 100% that it is, but you take a look at your Walmarts, your Targets, your everyday commodities. that are publicly traded, and you see them, if they haven't had the dramatic 30 and 40% reductions that other stocks have taken, they've held or even had some upside tick. And we're seeing that in the supply chain as well. What we're starting to see as people maybe realize the vulnerability in offshoring, we're certainly seeing a little bit of the conversations we're having with our decision makers is local sourcing opportunities are being created. Call that both nearshoring and onshoring. And we believe that, again, as we get to the last slide, we believe that's a best practice moving forward. There is some vulnerability that's been exposed in a dominant foreign supply chain environment, and I think we see this as coming back. And then again, the last, I think this goes back to that variable I talked about in the testing. The WTO is saying, the uncertainty in predicting recovery in terms of timing or impact is highly linked, to the length of the outbreak and the effectiveness of the response, and that really sits back into that testing piece as a bit of an unknown. Last couple things we'll hit. The restarting of supply chain engines, and someone asked me, what's with the picture of the lawnmower? If you have that hand mower from way back in the day, hopefully some of you remember what that looks like. I like to say, I remember my dad using one. I don't remember one. But if you put that in your garage for 3 years, went and took it out, you'd be able to mow the lawn without much of a problem. Restarting a supply chain engine, I think of it as much like restarting a lawnmower engine, in that you finish the season, you put it away. The first time you go to start that mower, it may very well start, it may very well run, but the first time you run it, the damage to the spark plugs, the damage if you haven't changed the oil, the damage if you've used older fuel, and I think there is some, again, an unseen risk, in restarting supply chains revolving around what damage has been done to the supply chain. And I think, again, there's one slide following this, and we'll talk a little about that when we go to best practices. Very interesting to see this remote environment. And I think, we're seeing companies that have never used remote environments, and I want to be careful with my words because we're all in New York. We see companies outside New York that are thriving in remote environments. What will happen with this remote environment moving forward? Will it create, a new way for companies to sort of engage and connect with their employees and their team members? So I certainly think this will be a challenge. How much pressure will employees put back on their employers on wanting more sort of remote access and remote environment? A couple things we're seeing, again, both seen and unseen. There's a community impact, and I think, again, this has been a clinical presentation up to this point. When you see those pictures of people on their balconies in Europe and in New York City, sort of singing with each other and coming together and people doing things for each other and helping older people out, carrying their groceries and picking supplies up for them. You try and find the positive in anything that's sort of negative or dark. And I believe there's been a significant community, a raising of the level of our being a community. And it will be interesting to see, how quickly we go back to minding our own business and doing our own thing, and how much sticks. We're concerned and we're looking out for each other, and I believe that's an important factor moving forward. I think what we haven't seen yet is the evolution of security, access, and movement. I'm a guy that goes to Whole Foods, and I like to go to the hot bar. That even exists anymore? Are you going to see any open food environments? Are you going to be able to walk into a building and walk the floors, whether that's a public building, a private building, a hospital, a commercial building? I think there'll be an evolution of security, of access, and of the movement of people and goods that's yet to unfold. And I don't know how we go backwards. Like I don't know how it goes back to the way it was, knowing how disruptive this impact currently is and where it's going. And I talked about the food chain significance yet to unfold. This is the last slide, and these are what I would describe as the these calls to action that I think are this is the meat and potatoes of this whole thing. Contingency management, and the reason that's here is everybody does disaster recovery. Right? You know, maybe you hire a company that does your disaster recovery. Maybe, you know, a couple weeks ago, you're all proud of yourself because you shut your systems down and you brought them back up and you went, hey, this is great, disaster recovery, we're all good. This is contingency management, a very, very different environment. And we're seeing some of our largest multinational Fortune 100 companies that realize they were significantly unprepared for contingency management. These are companies that lived through 9/11, Hurricane Sandy, and a number of other significant events. You know, my question and the call to action to all of you on the call is your business prepared for contingency management? And that's deployment of remote employees for an extended period of time. That's do you have AR and AP protocols with vendors in a state of emergency? Are you able to source product, raw material, and produce? Do you have other places you can produce product? Contingency management is a very, very dynamic piece, and I think this environment has exposed it's been really underdone. I think, you know, the relationship with the workforce, Mainfreight as an example is a very interesting environment. We've been deemed an essential service. A lot of that to do with the fact that we're not just because we're in transportation, but we have a significant space in those everyday sort of everyday commodities, those fast-moving consumer goods, and medical. So we have a. But the interesting thing for me is this. And within the Mainfreight group, I'm Mainfreight, so I'm deemed essential. Yet I'm working from home. We have drivers. We have warehouse team members who are working on the dock and in the trucks, and they're showing up at your business, and they're picking up your freight, and they're delivering your freight. And that's a very interesting dynamic. Why is that person essential and at risk of exposure? I'm essential, but I'm working from home. And it wasn't until I put it in my own personal context that it led me to this second call to action. Does it force our business to relook and rethink the relationship we have with all of our team members? And I certainly think if you took a look at your own organization, that rethink is clearly out there. And by the way, all those things I talked about, Amazon hiring new jobs, you know, they're going to have, I believe today, you know, they're undergoing massive work stoppage and massive protests outside their facilities. Again, rethinking the relationship with the workforce in terms of the designation of, and I think that's in front of us as a call to action. I think tactically identifying at-risk suppliers and evaluating logistics partners. Everyone sitting on this call right now that's in a manufacturing and distribution environment, again, this is not just about checking in, hey, how you guys doing? This is about doing a due diligence deep dive into your suppliers, into its financial risk, its geographic risk, it's your own employee risk. And this is not picking up the phone. How are you guys doing? Oh, you're fine. Don't worry. We're going to get you guys. You'll be back online in 30 days, 60 days. Everything's good. We believe that there's a significant due diligence to this. That is really a call to action right now. And then an evaluation of logistics partners. We've you know, again, and you know, because I'm plugged into it, we've seen drivers let go. We've seen warehouses shut down. We've seen restrictions on service, restrictions on capacity. Is your logistics partner built for contingency management? Are they built to withstand really significant pressure around the supply chain? one of the most important things I think in the call to action is this reset of historical inventory, both levels and locations. There's there's a lot of really smart people that said you only need to have this much inventory. This is how you manage it on the books. There's a smart play. Let the vendor hold the inventory. Keep a lot of it on the ocean as it transit. It's not on your books yet. There was a lot of people that realized they have taken on at face value historic inventory levels and locations, and realized that, boy, if I just had stuff sitting on the West Coast right now, things would be different. Or if I just had a supplier in the Midwest instead of everything being in Vietnam, things would be different. I think there's a very substantial reset that will happen on the amount of stock that people keep on hand, what they keep on hand, and where it's being kept on hand. This is a really interesting piece. That last statement is highly connected to visibility. And I think for me, what we're seeing in some of the conversations we're having is, geez, Tom, our supplier told us, they had plenty of stuff ready to go. Turns out they didn't. They told us they had shipped it before. Turns out they didn't. They said they gave it to the trucker. We don't know where it is. Our facility, our distribution center is closed. The stuff was already out, set to be delivered. We don't know where it's gone. We don't know if it's still on the truck. We don't know if it's come back to a warehouse. We believe that there'll be a revaluation, and there should be a revaluation on supply chain visibility. And then supply network mapping. And this really goes into that. I took a bit of a takeaway from the Harvard Business Review. This really is a connectivity of procurement with business and finance about the gaps that they're currently seeing right now, and how they sort of protect a company from those disruptive events in the future, how to align procurement goals with overall business objectives. And again, I took that directly from last week's Harvard Business Review. We believe that supply network mapping will now should no longer be done in a procurement silo or in a logistics silo or in a supply chain silo. It has to be done across sales, across finance, across executive leadership, and bringing all of that together so all of those pieces are moving in concert. If you're an organization or of an organization that sort of has that silo orientation, I think this becomes a great call to action to see how do we create real strategic alignment. I know it says it in the brochure, but I don't know that we do it every day. And that's the end of the program, guys. You've made it a full 40 minutes into the program, and I appreciate your patience and the opportunity. Happy to take any questions that you guys might have.
Tom, I don't see any questions in the queue, but if anybody listening wants to type one in real quick, we'll make sure Tom gets it. Oh, wait a minute. We might have one. There is a question coming. We did get a question, when can we get a copy of this deck? This presentation will be posted, is being recorded, and will be posted on the CEG website for you to go back to and or share with your staff. And so that will be coming up in the next day or two on our website. I think we have another question coming from Larry.
I don't know if can you open the microphones at this point? Would that help? There it is.
Oh, I just had it here. In the first couple of slides, you mentioned 200 of 500 Fortune 500 companies are in Wuhan. Can you explain more? Is this related to suppliers linked to 200 of the 500 or the headquarters based companies?
Good question, Larry. So there's like the Fortune 100, the Fortune 500, the Fortune 1000. This is the global Fortune 500, right? So it's a global view of those 500 companies. So 200 plus of those 500 have presence in Wuhan. So it's not necessarily corporate headquarters, but actual manufacturing, distribution. It could be joint venture. They have some supply chain of significance that they're connected to in Wuhan. I don't know if that helps answer your question. So and then the suppliers related to them. So they're physically there, and then all those tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers are there. I don't know, does that help answer the question? I want to tell me if you need a little more info.
Larry responded by saying, yes, perfect, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions by anybody? Well, I will say thank you, Tom, for giving us both that global and domestic view of the supply chain industry. A lot of work to do there, obviously, and we'll see how all this shapes out for you. If anyone would want to contact Tom and doesn't have his contact information, please email Andrea or me at the CEG office. I'm John G. at CEG.org, and I'll connect you with Tom. And again, the presentation has been recorded and will be up on our website in a little bit. And we also want to invite you to attend our other webinars that we have. There's an entire series coming up that is on the calendar on the CEG website on many other great topics that may help your companies. So thank you very, very much, Tom, and for everybody who attended this morning.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.